This was something that he wanted to sit there for minutes upon minutes and watch her die.
The details of the case are almost too shocking to believe. A Pennsylvania man takes his girlfriend on a cross-country road trip with plans to get married in Las Vegas. But instead of a newlywed adventure in Sin City, he makes internet searches for phrases like dump body, all before luring the woman into the Nevada desert. He says it's part of a bondage photo shoot and convinces her to undress and get tied up. But instead of taking pictures, he duct tapes her mouth and nose shut and watches her die.
She knew she was dying, and it was probably excruciating, and it can take minutes to die under asphyxiation, and she was fully conscious. And so for him, this is something that he was clearly taking pleasure in.
But that is not even where the story ends. After leaving her naked body tied up to a signpost, he heads back to Pennsylvania, where he begins impersonating his ex online to her friends and family. It quickly became a case for the FBI, and that's why we reached out to former CIA officer and FBI agent Tracy Walder.
I think Chapman wanted to watch someone die.
There's been some major movement in the case this summer, but it actually dates back to 2019. In mid-September of that year, 33-year-old Jaime Feden went on a cross-country road trip with her boyfriend, John Matthew Chapman. According to court docs, Chapman presented the trip to the victim under the guise of a camping excursion, coinciding with his internet searches on how to dispose of a body. Upon the victim's protesting that she did not want to partake in a camping trip, Chapman told the victim that they were going on a vacation to Las Vegas. So Chapman misled JF, that's Jaime Feden, to believe the purpose of the trip was a vacation to look at potential residences in Las Vegas. By the time they hit the road, Feden believed that they would go house hunting and potentially get married. The trip started in the city of Bethel Park in southwest Pennsylvania. Together, Chapman and Feden drove the some 2,000 miles to Nevada, eventually ending up about 2.5 hours north of Las Vegas in rural Lincoln County. During this time, Chapman is making incriminating searches like dump body and Nevada. Eventually, he convinced Feden to drive into the desert under the guise of participating in a sadomasochistic and bondage-themed photo shoot. After that, Chapman used plastic zip ties to affix the victim to a signpost. After applying duct tape to her mouth and then her nose, Chapman watched the victim die from asphyxiation. After all that, Chapman left JF's naked body next to the signpost and traveled back to Pennsylvania, discarding her clothes at various locations along the return route.
So in this particular case, just looking at the facts and looking at the court documents, I think what was the most, I don't want to say surprising because nothing is really surprising anymore, is how premeditated this was. And premeditated in a very elaborate, very complicated way. You know, typically folks that are looking to unfortunately commit murder, there is premeditation involved, but typically it's in a very, simplistic form. I think Chapman wanted to watch someone die.
Investigators say Feden was murdered on September 25th, 2019, and her body was found in the desert on October 5th, 2019. A boy and his grandfather were in the area and thought it may be the body of an animal, but after approaching the signpost, they found it was something much more sinister. They contacted law enforcement, and for a time, the body was unidentified. There was no indication it belonged to Feden because she hadn't even been reported missing. In fact, her friends and family were still in contact with her when the body was found. The thing that's interesting at the time, though, is that her friends and family are getting messages from her, allegedly, on Facebook. So is this difficult for investigators to kind of confirm whether the person is still alive or still around, or whether it's really them messaging from these Facebook accounts?
So they can determine sometimes just if you look at an IP address, right, whether or not it is the individual. Now, just because an IP address might trace to a different place other than her home, doesn't necessarily mean it's not her, but it does give them a place to start in terms of identifying a suspect, someone who is using an IP address from that particular location.
Detectives eventually determined the person sending the messages from Feden's account was actually Chapman. He'd also been living inside her home and spending some of her money. It wasn't until November 19th, 2019, when Federer's friends finally sounded the alarm and requested a welfare check. At what point is it something that friends or family should call for a welfare check if they haven't actually seen the person in real life? They were getting messages via Facebook, but haven't really seen her.
So, I think you really are entitled anytime after 24 hours, to be completely honest. I also think, too, because there was a history of potential abuse going on between the two of them, that they would have had, rightfully so, a cause for concern. But, I want to stress to people that you don't necessarily need a cause for concern to ask for a welfare check. Just not seeing the individual, not being able to make contact with them are more than enough in terms of grounds for a welfare check.
When Bethel Park police entered Federer's home, she wasn't inside, but what they did find is curious. So, when investigators did go inside, obviously Jaime was not in there, but something they found inside was her cell phone, which to me, in this day and age, is rare to leave your house without your cell phone. It kind of signifies something is off. They also found inside some duct tape and zip ties. Do you think any of these three things were a red flag for investigators?
I think all of them were, and I could be wrong, but I thought they found her identification as well, but maybe they didn't. You know, Typically, if someone is leaving on their own volition or on their own accord, they're going to take, at a bare minimum, their identification with them. They may not take a cell phone if they want to change that out or whatever. However, I do think it was enough to initially arise the suspicion of the police to think that maybe this is someone that didn't leave on their own volition.
Bethel Park police eventually arrest Chapman, who comes clean pretty quickly. When it finally comes time to investigators tracking him down and taking him into custody, he does admit to all of these things and sort of fesses up to what happened. Do you have any idea what that interview could have looked like? How police officers or investigators would have asked him these questions?
I mean, I think they were probably pretty straightforward, especially if they got a confession out of him. That tells me that he probably wasn't combative nor asking for an attorney. Obviously, he was Mirandized when he was arrested. And so they probably just came right out with the questions. It's difficult to get a confession, obviously, straight away. Not something that can take days, weeks, months. But for him to do so immediately, that just tells me that they literally arrested him, Mirandized him, brought him back in, and he confessed. It probably happened that methodically and that quickly.
After Chapman's arrest, we start learning the shocking details of the case. To start, investigators learned that those closest to Feder were concerned about Chapman even before her disappearance. The fact that her friends and family had been wary of him in the past, that he potentially was abusive physically or verbally, and she had stood her ground, said, no, I'm going to stick with him. So it sounds like over the course of these several months, when other people may have seen red flags, that she didn't, and potentially he was coaxing her into a false sense of security.
It's just heartbreaking, to be completely honest. I think this is a woman who absolutely fell in love, and he figured out what her insecurities were and preyed on those. And I think it's completely heartbreaking.
Then there was Chapman's elaborate ruse, convincing Feder to take a 30-plus-hour road trip from one end of the country to the other. Do you think that that screams premeditation? The fact that he took her so far, had so many chances to turn around and call this off, but went through with it anyway?
I mean, it's 100% premeditation. I've seen some people trying to compare this to Brian Laundrie and Gabby Petito. And in a way, it is similar in that he did use her social media and her text message to make it seem like she was still alive. But I don't think that Brian Laundrie took Gabby Petito with the sole reason of killing her. I think they had an abusive relationship that came to that. I think in this, you have a situation where Chapman took her with the sole reason, had probably 2 days or so in a vehicle to really think about what he was doing, not to mention weeks and months before to prepare for that. So this is a case of extreme premeditation.
That extreme premeditation includes packing things Chapman would later use in Federer's murder. As far as the duct tape, the zip ties, all of those things, do you think that that could be labeled, I guess even colloquially, as a kill kit?
I mean, that's what people do colloquially refer to them as, right? Things that you carry with you all the time in basically a little box. If anyone's seen Criminal Minds, there was the most recent one was that he was hiding them all over the United States, these kill kits. And yes, they have things that make subduing a victim and then ultimately killing them easier. So you don't have to run to the store per se and get them. But obviously, it would point very much towards premeditation for anyone to have what's so-called a kill kit with them, because what is the intent behind you using that?
Meanwhile, Chapman's internet search history is riddled with red flags. According to court documents, the night before the couple arrived in Las Vegas, Chapman searched online for terms such as dump, body, and Nevada.
Obviously, if you think about, from the defense perspective, right, they're going to say, how do you know that he actually made those searches, right? How do you know that he typed those in? That's where that's going to come into play. But of course, it doesn't help him in terms of premeditation and being incriminating.
But Chapman didn't let on to his plans to kill Feder right away and still managed to lure her into the desert with plans for a unique photo shoot. The fact that we're taking photos of each other, okay, but it adds a layer that it's this bondage shoot. So he kind of has an excuse to tie her up. What do you make of that?
Well, I think he was preying off of the fact that she trusted him to be tied up, right? And that he wouldn't harm her. And so, I think, look, couples taking pictures of each other, I don't necessarily find that odd or strange. But taking her out into the middle of the desert, which is quite remote and gets pretty extreme in terms of temperatures, I think was probably a red flag. But at the same time, I'm not sure that her suspicions were raised, because this was an individual that she trusted, and it was something that maybe wasn't out of the ordinary to them.
It was only after Feder was already zip tied to the signpost that Chapman covered her mouth and nose with duct tape. Do you have any idea what perhaps could have been going through their minds in those moments?
Well, asphyxiation is a slower way to die, but it's also a personal way of killing someone. Now, he didn't strangle her, obviously. She died because of, as you mentioned, her nose and mouth being covered. For her, she knew exactly what was happening to her. And I think that is horrific. She knew she was dying, and it was probably excruciating. And it can take minutes to die under asphyxiation. And she was fully conscious. And so for him, this is something that he was clearly taking pleasure in. This was not, in my opinion, where you see stabbings over and over again, sort of this crime of passion. This was not that. This was something that he wanted to sit there for minutes upon minutes and watch her die.
And the fact that he left her there in the desert, tied up, she was naked to this signpost, does that in your mind add a layer of cruelty to the crime?
I think the whole thing is cruel, quite frankly. Luring someone from their home, driving 30 plus hours, knowing full well what is going to happen to them, preying off of the security that that person feels towards you, and then watching them die and leaving them out in the elements, and then impersonating them to their friends and family. The entire thing is exceptionally cruel.
After leaving Federer's body out in the desert, Chapman proceeded to drive the 2,000 miles back to Pennsylvania and set up shop in Federer's home, even impersonating her. What do you make of all of this? That he was kind of going along with this masquerade that Jaime was still alive, living in her home, pretending to be her on Facebook chat, but in reality, he had known that she was murdered.
My guess, and again, I'm obviously not in his mind, nor do I want to be, but my guess is he thought that her body wouldn't be found. And that if it was found, because again, you have the extremes of the desert, if it was found, it wouldn't necessarily be identifiable. And so I think that he didn't think it would be found as quickly as it was. And so I think he was keeping up that charade in the hopes that people would eventually, I don't want to say drop it, but just think, okay, she really did run away. She doesn't want to be contacted. Let's not continue looking for her, in the hopes that her body would decompose to a point that it would be very difficult to identify her.
After Chapman's arrest, Bethel Park police were involved in the case, but the investigation expanded far beyond there. We've talked a lot about the distance in this case from Pennsylvania all the way to Nevada, many hours worth of driving. So, this is obviously across many state lines, making it a federal case. And the FBI did get involved at some point. Do you have any idea what that involvement would have looked like?
So my guess is the FBI will probably allow Nevada to have jurisdiction under this case, or Pennsylvania, one of the two states. It really just depends. My guess is the FBI came in regards to digital forensic evidence, like we were talking about before. So the Facebook messages that he was using, cell phone towers, cell phone pinging. The FBI just has more manpower, quite frankly, to be able to do that. It's very similar to what we saw in the Idaho case. They were brought in really for digital forensics processing, and that's about it. And that crossed state lines as well because he lived in Washington and committed the crime in Idaho. And so I think that is the sole reason that they were brought in.
So, we talked about the cell phone towers, the pinging, the location, things like that. But would it matter what the messages said when he was pretending to be her on Facebook? Is that something that FBI agents would analyze, perhaps?
I think they would analyze it to simply narrow down a suspect. I'm not sure that they took what he was saying and then used it against him because the reality is they had a confession, right? They had all of his internet searches in regards to premeditation. So obviously, aside from being just cruel, right, leading her family on and leading them to believe that she's alive, and then helping them narrow down him as a suspect, I'm not sure that it would have necessarily been used against him to convict him.
On February 20th, 2020, Chapman was charged with one count of kidnapping resulting in death. In May of this year, Chapman was tried in federal court. The trial lasted for 8 days and he was found guilty. His sentence was handed down on August 2nd. This case eventually went to trial federally. He was convicted and has been sentenced to life in prison. What do you feel about that? Do you think justice was served in this case?
Yeah, I think justice was served. I mean, obviously, we can get into discussions about whether or not the death penalty is a good thing or a bad thing. I don't really want to get into that. But I think from a federal perspective, they are not typically seeking the death penalty. They can federally, but they don't typically do that. So, I mean, he is going to spend the rest of his life in prison. There's no way that he is getting out. He will spend it in a federal institution. And, essentially, he's on the younger side. And so, really, the rest of his natural life is going to be decades.
Walder says if you find yourself in a situation like Fetter's, there could be things to keep an eye out for. We talked a bit about warning signs, how Jaime's friends and family may have said something's off in this relationship, but it didn't seem that she personally may have caught on to any of these warning signs or perhaps ignored them. So if somebody's watching this and they're going through a relationship, is there any sort of red flags or warning signs people should keep an eye out for?
I mean, look, I think anyone that is trying to elicit extreme control over you, your movements, your whereabouts, the things you're doing, I think is a red flag. But I think the problem is we genuinely love these people. And so then it becomes really, really difficult for victims to separate themselves. And I don't want to blame any victim in this situation because they are not. They shouldn't take any of that blame at all. The blame lies completely with the suspect for doing this to them. But I do want to caution people: emotional abuse, physical abuse is never okay. But I think the biggest warning sign to start looking out for is extreme control.
As part of Chapman's confession, he admitted that he killed Fetter for financial reasons. After his conviction, his team appealed, asking for another trial, but that was denied back in June. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Gillespie.